Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the transmission. The best way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, a little over $9 a month. We do weekly group Zoom chats for members only to shoot the breeze on what's happening in the world. I also do a weekly roundup of the best headlines, most important headlines of the week, and provide my own unique, interesting analysis and commentary. You can also donate through Buy Me a Coffee, Donor Box, Wise, and other such platforms. Purchase a consult if you want to chat with me about anything, and check out all of my affiliates over at the website. Everyone from Escape the Technocracy, Wise Wolf Gold, Above Phone, to Easy DNS for domains and hosting. And leave a podcast review if you haven't on Spotify, Apple, and wherever else you can leave a review. Joining us for the first time is Dr. Christopher Mott, who's a Washington Fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and former researcher and desk officer at the U.S. Department of State. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Chris.
That's great to be here.
You know, it's funny. I've been wanting to have you on the podcast for a while, and then I think the last time I tried a couple of years back, I couldn't find your email. I couldn't send you messages on X because you don't receive messages. And what do you know? Just some days or weeks ago, you followed me on X, so that allowed me to message you. And it's funny, I'm finding eventually interesting people come to me. The other day, George Friedman followed me on X, so I'm going to see if I can have him on the podcast. Robert Kaplan, his people have asked to have him back on the podcast to discuss his new book coming out in January. So very interesting. And just real quick, for people who are not aware of you, if you could just tell us about your research, the work that you do.
Sure. Yeah. Well, first I'll apologize for that. I'm not trying to be hard to contact. I'm just not a very good or frequent X user. So whatever there is going on there, well, I'll gradually learn about it, I'm sure. My professional life so far was originally I was supposed to be either work in an archive or be a history professor. I first went into academia with the historical focus. Over the course of college, I got to experience the wonderful joys of the Bush administration, and particularly its second term. And it really kind of made me, my focus in history already was on the geopolitical side of things. So it made me kind of like interested also in the contemporary world. So I ended up pivoting in grad school to the international relations side of things. Ended up spending some time in academia there, published a book on Central Asian history that's like Central Asian history from a purely geopolitical perspective, trying to show that there was like a concept of grand strategy in nomadic states in particular, and that this left a lasting legacy throughout the region. So I was like a kind of hybrid person. But after academia, I was able to join the State Department and give me some policy experience and kind of see federal bureaucracy from the inside, which was really cool and useful. And I was always fascinated by the think tank world, but I never until the late 2010s saw there for an opportunity for someone who had like the kind of interests I did, because like most think tanks are very, very either liberal internationalist or very interventionist. But in the late 2010s, when I was leaving DC, that started to change. And so I saw an opportunity there. First, I was with defense priorities, and then I ended up at Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, where I am now. And it's kind of like after a long time in the exile, like the kind of defensive realists are finally finding each other, right? And building these networks. And it's a very catch up from behind, right? Like we're still very much outside of like the policy making circles, but it's got to start somewhere. And that's just been a thing that I think I've been a part of for a few years now. Eventually, I think in the long run, I would probably go back to history, but I feel like right now there's so much ferment with like what is happening and questioning the old assumptions about foreign policy that we have inherited from multiple generations of hegemony that are just increasingly obsolete, that I think now is really the time to really push, right? To push for, a more grounded understanding of the world, and it's a polycentric, multipolar world, and there's just a lot of people in the North Atlantic that are very, very in denial about that. So as long as that's the case, I think there's a strong push to be made. in the direction of realism and restraint. And we've seen the relative success, despite how young it is, of like the Quincy Institute really showing, there's a desire for this, even with policymaking people, which is something I had come to doubt, a few years ago when I was living in DC. So it's nice to see, and it's an interesting world, and I definitely think that podcasts like your own are proof that there's a hunger in the general populace to really question a lot of these narratives, and to understand that there's a lot of dangers in pretending that the world is a way which it is not.
Yeah, I mean, heck, even Jeff Bezos came out the other day saying many people are turning to off-the-cuff podcasts, right? And so they're tuning out from the mainstream. And you mentioned your book on Central Asia. I love Central Asia. I used to live in Mongolia as a Peace Corps volunteer in a yurt in the Gobi.
That's awesome.
What was that?
That's awesome. Yeah, I actually, it was my first solo trip as an adult was Mongolia. After high school graduation, I saved up money, and everyone else was like going to Cancun, and I was like, "Anyone want to go to Mongolia?" No, okay, I'll go myself. And that was like right after I graduated. I ended up spending like a summer there. It was really cool.
Well, I ended up in Cancun, sort of here in Mexico, but yeah, that's how my trip ended up. It started out in Mongolia, and I've also lived in Kazakhstan, the north, and it's so Central Asia. I fell in love with it. For me, my favorite part of Asia is Central Asia. The coldest part, it's like Ulaanbaatar is the coldest capital city, but I wouldn't. I don't think I'd be able to join the State Department. My sibling applied. I studied international relations in Geneva at the Geneva School of Diplomacy. Right across was the U.S. Mission to the UN, U.S. Embassy. My sibling, I think, applied to work in the State Department, and she was denied because her thesis advisor for the master's was none other than Dutch-American international lawyer Curtis Dobler, who was Saddam Hussein's defense. He was part of Saddam Hussein's defense. And I've had the Department of Homeland Security ban me from PayPal, so that alone should tell me that they would never hire someone of my profile, because to work for the blob, you have to be one with the blob, right? To think identically, and they cannot any inkling of dissent. Sorry, you cannot work for the State Department. And just real quick, you mentioned realism. Your blog, if I'm not mistaken, is The Trickster's Guide to Geopolitics.
Yeah, GeoTrickster is my personal blog. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're talking about realism. Just myself studying international relations, I've just always held pretty much the real real sort of realist school of thought that the world is run by interests. Wasn't it Kissinger that said that it's there's the quote about interests. I can't remember now, but it's basically states have interests that change, and it's not so much ideology. But
yeah, I think the quote is the United States has no permanent friends; it only has permanent interests, which is a requote of, I believe, maybe a Lord Palmerston quote from the 19th century Britain, like a kind of modified version of it, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, and just real quick on what's your sort of perspective in international relations? I think you write in your blog, quote, "The U.S. is the most powerful country in the world, and despite the perceptions of Europeans to the contrary, is not primarily a realist country. It slides around the scale of militarized liberalism with only occasional flashes of stone-cold realism. I've also come to increasingly suspect that many aspects of the U.S. foreign policy establishment actually believes their own civic mythology." So just briefly on your sort of realist perspective.
Yeah, so I mean, my particular take on realism, like a lot of stuff, doesn't really come originally from like philosophy or theory. It just came from like my interest in world history and like just like studying how people behave, like and how states behave. But like I didn't know anything about international relations theory until I entered grad school. But to me, realism instantly clicked because it was like, I mean, I'm not saying anything is a perfect model for anything. I don't believe in perfect models, but it was just like, that was the one that was like, oh, that's how like states actually behave in the long run. Now, the exception to this is when a state is so successful for a long time that it gets high on its own supply. And it's actually interesting to hear that from the About section of my blog put it back to me, because I think I wrote that in like 2017, like when I was still at State. And by the way, I'm sure I could not get rehired at State, right? Because my publication record when I joined in 2016 was like my book, which was history focused, and I'm sure they didn't read. Though I did find it in their library, interestingly enough, and I didn't put it there. So there you go. But it was my book and like two peer-reviewed publications that were not very interesting. So like I think now that I have a lot of publications that are a lot spicier, yeah, and there's no way in hell they'd ever take me back. But the thing with realism is that I think that the one time that people don't behave as realists is when they've been successful for a long time and they say, well, surely there must be something more. Surely we, the protagonists of history, this is the danger of hubris, right? We, the protagonists of history, are going to provide some kind of permanent legacy or evolve like the human experience in some way. And so that's when you tend to get like the weirder stuff happens. And that I think is comorbid with the kind of like declining aspects of great powers, right? They believe that they're different all of a sudden, that the same rules that led to their success previously no longer apply because they've fundamentally changed the game. But states aren't eternal, you know, like they have limited time before they either change unrecognizably or cease to exist. And what keeps people on their toes is like a kind of sense of danger, a sense of non-specialness, if you will. Group solidarity comes from a certain sense of kind of egalitarianism that goes away when a society becomes very overly ruled by money. I'm very much a student of Ibn Khaldun. He was probably my favorite political theorist, and I think he saw this as early as the 14th century. That all the states are founded by people who are well connected with each other and who have a degree of like personal loyalty with each other. And then as they by necessity bureaucratize as they expand, sometimes the bureaucracy itself becomes the point. Sometimes the mythology of the state becomes the point. And the U.S. has been, I would say, arguably the most successful state in world history, at least in a short-term kind of perspective, just in the global nature of its influence and how the very minor costs it had to pay to become this powerful, just kind of sitting by while its enemies destroyed themselves. And geography, I think, is the single most important thing in that factor too. But this has kind of enabled the American elite, I think, to particularly forget about the role of geography, most important. If I have one cause in all of this, it's like to remind Americans that geography is really important. But yeah, it's the role of geography in their good fortune, the role of resources and other material things, and how this kind of like liberal international world order that came later is more kind of like the excuse as to like justifying keeping this arrangement rather than the actual reality of why it's successful. And it's also, it's led to some policies that have undermined American power, ironically enough, because it's so obsessed with hegemony. Offshoring, obviously, economic offshoring, deindustrialization, the free trade policies, I would say, in many cases. These things have actually undermined a lot of American advantages. And so it's just like when you have multiple generations of this complacent elite, they lose touch with realism. Now, the interesting thing is, if you spend enough time in DC and you talk to people, everyone claims to be a realist. Everyone, no matter like what they believe. And they're like, well, I know how to like work in the bureaucracy. So of course I know that you're actually the idealist because you think that there's like this like perfect realism and you don't see how the bureaucracy works. And I do think that there are some people that view realism itself as kind of a ideal thing and put it on the pedestal, and that's a legit criticism. But whereas pragmatism should be its real defining measure. But the thing is, what they're ignoring when they say that is that like the key point of realism in the international relations is that like the state should not have like a mission aside from survival and prosperity, right? Like it shouldn't have this dedication to world transformation, and it should, and this is the most important thing, be able to diplomatically come to arrangements with anyone, regardless of what their domestic politics are. Like there's a big difference between domestic and foreign policy, and like realists really uphold that distinction. Whereas I think that like many liberals and like constructivists and other people really try to blur that distinction. But when the chips are down, and a society doesn't have the luxury of being able to pick and choose who it declares to be good and bad, it's going to ally with whoever's in its interest. And it also can end alliances with people who it previously had good alliances with. And this is something that I think is implicit to realism that you don't see. In DC, like permanent alliances are the name of the game. The idea is to kind of spread a permanent influence network because it makes a lot of money. It's like a captive defense market, of course, and you have influence over other people's trade policy. But also, it's like very self-flattering, right? It's very like we're the center, like we're spreading this thing around the world, and everywhere it goes, it just makes everything so much better, and it really causes them to lose sight of things, and as well as it's dangerous for the host country because all of a sudden you can no longer tell what your own national interest is and you conflate it with international capital, frankly. And that creates problems, particularly when you're deindustrializing. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'd agree with what you said, whether people like it or not, that I think America is, the empire is the biggest example, best in history. I mean, I would argue it's the biggest empire in all of history that we've seen. I mean, you talk about Roman Empire, whatever other empire. When have you seen nearly 1,000 military bases strewn across the planet? And then the other methods of its control, through the Bretton Woods system, IMF, World Bank. I've had the economic hitman, John Perkins, on the podcast multiple times, and they control from behind the scenes, color revolutions, regime changes, through puppets and so forth. And so I'd agree with you. There's the biggest in all of history. And I think I heard you on a podcast, or your colleague Arta use the term terraforming. So they're terraforming the planet. And what you alluded to, this American exceptionalism. And just to get your further thoughts on the empire, this podcast was born out of my for whatever reason, I just always thought about, when I learned about the empire, I didn't even know that I was a citizen of the empire. This is the funniest thing. They're so good at hiding it, isn't it? Because when I grew up, teenager, late teens, I just thought, United States is a country, and then you realize, no, it's it's an empire, and they're doing crazy things, starting these insane wars, and basically just get your thoughts on where the empire is, where it's going. Some people call it the globalist American empire, this North Atlantic empire. I basically, for me, it's Washington, London, and Brussels as one blob. And, you had Niall Ferguson recently come out, I think he's a Scottish mainstream historian, and he begged the question as regards the empire: are we the Soviets? Are we the baddies? And, I just watched his speech last night. I laughed because, okay, thanks, Niall. I left the empire in 2006. So almost 20 years ago, I was calling it the United Soviet States of America, the USSA, instead of USA 20 years ago. But, we have to wait for Niall to. I like some of his work, but just your thoughts on where the empire is. Is it declining, and so forth?
It's definitely declining. I think that the denial that is the case by many in the elite is actually the biggest problem. I mean, you can make a case one way or the other. If some degree of imperialism benefits the United States, obviously, I'd say having a incredibly powerful navy is actually really important. It's like the one thing that helps the distance factor make sense. But the ruinous defense expenditures overall, the complete willing to underwrite many countries to keep them compliant, right? So you spend disproportionately on other countries' defense in exchange that they have less autonomy. This is not great. The further you go into Eurasia, the further you go away from your strengths, which are the oceans around the Western Hemisphere. So expansion actually leads to decline once you hit a certain point. That's not atypical. I mean, I would say that's the case for most empires. There's a certain point where they leave their specialty zone and the costs go up and the benefits go down. But the system is meant to expand, so they just keep doing it. I mean, I think that the Mongol Empire going into the Arab lands and South China was fundamentally destabilizing to the entire empire, probably cut its unity and its prosperity short by multiple generations. And the Romans endlessly fighting Persians over places like Armenia and Iraq. It's just there's so much And the British just took over a quarter of the world, but half of that wasn't even like productive. And then of course they justified continuing to expand when it no longer even benefited them by selling it as a mission to civilize, right? We're actually doing it for people's own good. We're raising humanity to a new standard. Kind of famous old Victorian ads of like Pear soap washes like the heathen barbarian away. But like that's the aspect that we've internalized. Like in that way, and Neil Ferguson, who I'm not a fan of at all, but because we're like we have similar observations, but on the exact opposite side of if they're good or bad. But like he actually is right when he originally used to compare the U.S. to the British Empire. I think that's the real comparison point. The Soviet element, I think, is there in like the weird doublespeak and the disingenuousness nature of everything, and the fact that there's this kind of mindless bureaucracy that is just like limping along and trying to avoid blame. That part is very Soviet. That's very like 1980s Soviet Union. But I think overall our structure is very similar to the British Empire, and that is its obsession with markets, its obsession with undermining foreign people's sovereignty, its obsession with kind of like culturally converting people, and legally modifying like how its partners in quotes behave. It has a missionary mentality, and it has a very strong sense of moral self-righteousness. And I think that honestly, like when you look at like how the British Empire behaved, how it was actually a major exporter and expander of the transatlantic slave trade. And then once that was no longer economically beneficial and industrialization began, it became an abolitionist empire that would then attack and invade countries under the excuse of ending the slave trade. And like to me, this is very much like how the American empire operates, right? It's okay, we're going to go in and make money like all empires do, but then once we do, we have to keep the whole like defense acquisitions thing going. We have to keep like the private contractors funded. We have to keep the lobbyists happy, you know. And so it then becomes a self-perpetuating mechanism. Like, oh, we forget that we may have intervened in this part of the world before and messed everything up. We have to intervene again because things are messed up. And so like the R2P, responsibility to protect, becomes our version of like the British mission to civilize. And much like that, it's a constant repetition of intervening in the same places over and over again to clean up the messes that we helped perpetuate in the first place. But this is a never-ending grift, and it certainly makes a lot of people a lot of money. At the same time, it makes a lot of people feel very proud of themselves and feel very in the center of things. Like you can say there's many people in the American professional managerial class who do not benefit from this, but support it anyway. And this was also an observation made in the early 20th century about like the British administrative class. The empire wasn't really benefiting their society as much, but there were these like middle class people who were very tied up in administering the empire or like propagandizing for it. And they saw it as a great opportunity, not only to keep their careers, but to like view themselves as doing super important critical work. And I feel like it's not just like people in the US state that do that. I actually think right now the biggest problem we have with this is actually the media. That our supposedly independent media has really internalized like liberal internationalism in particular, but in general the whole kind of idea of like America protects the world from this like quote unquote like evil force, this like authoritarian axis is the term I've unironically heard, and I'm sure you have too. And it's just a very ridiculous idea. First of all, that like there's a values clash is the primary thing that's going on, rather than just different power poles reasserting themselves after a long unipolar domination. But also, like this idea is so obviously on its face hypocritical, because like we will constantly whine about human rights and domestic governance of countries we don't like, while we're super close with Israel and Saudi Arabia and who knows who else. And we've always done that, and I'm not criticizing that because, like, although I don't like either of those alliances, but from that perspective, like that's what powers do. That's realism, right? Like you're friends with whoever it benefits you, but we can't even admit that, and we have like at this point an entire group of people from our generation, I think, who went to like Ivy League schools and whatnot, who've really internalized this, who have internalized this post-Cold War mentality. and who actually genuinely see this as like really important. Like, oh, whatever complaints you have about American foreign policy, at least we're protecting some kind of vaguely defined free world. But like, I don't think that's true at all. And I think there's going to be a very hard wake up call for people that believe something like that. And it really doesn't help that all of our public discussions in the legacy press are couched in these terms, right? There's always this like, when you see, and you can see it on their face, like when on the rare occasion that like a journalist hears something from even like the realism and restraint community, like not even talking like a far left or far right activist or anything, but like some typical thing that we would discuss about on a weekly basis in the realism and restraint community, like they look lost and incredulous. They're like, what? Like, are you saying that like we don't just like spread freedom and happiness everywhere we go? Or are you saying that like, you know, like you don't care what Russia's domestic governance looks like? And I'm like, yeah, you know,
Yeah.
it's just, yeah.
I just want to. I want to go further on that point. You know, the channel on LinkedIn is growing, and you can really see the difference between the crowd on the Telegram or X and LinkedIn. And it's boy, like some of the stuff I post there gets semi-viral, and you get these liberal internationalist woke professionals from around the world. You know, I posted a clip from Putin at BRICS. You know, he answered the last question from the BBC reporter Steve Rosenberg, which was interesting. But some of the comments on the LinkedIn, and it's like they say, you know, Russia is this terrorist fascist state. And what gets me is what you just mentioned, this total hypocrisy and double standards of these liberal, I call them liberal globalists, liberal internationalists. And even here in Mexico, I taught at the Ivy League of Mexico, you know, the Tec de Monterrey, where they've had, you know, Hillary Clinton come and Bill Gates and Al Gore, and I don't even know, Thomas Friedman, you know, all this liberal internationalist class. And what you just described, you get this in Geneva. I had a professor who, you know, thought George Bush was the best thing since sliced bread. He overheard us, some of us students, talking about how George Bush was a war criminal. He's like, really? How can you think George Bush? He's a good guy, you know?
I can't even imagine someone in today's or even after 2005 thinking that George Bush is great.
No, but I mean, but that's that class, and just, you know, the latest examples, you know, in Moldova, we had this regime change in, you know, this EU referendum for Moldova to accede to the EU. I believe Brussels remote controls everything, and so if you ask me, it was a regime change. It was a fraudulent vote, and then Georgia just rejected the Western liberal internationalism for sovereignty. And then you have Ursula von der Leyen come out, and all these other people say, it's like, we like democracy, but not when we don't win, right? We don't like that kind of democracy. And so this is fascism. So this guy on my LinkedIn who's calling whatever wants to say about Putin, I don't care. But we are the baddies, as Niall Ferguson says. Well, we are fascists. Like we can't just, we talk about democracy and liberty. Meanwhile, they're silencing American citizens like myself. We're regime changing. How is regime change democracy? You know, it's totally insane. So your sort of your thoughts on that, but also the woke aspect of this. You guys wrote an amazing piece. I think it was I got a lot of play a couple of years back, called "Woke Imperium: The Coming Confluence Between Social Justice and Neoconservatism." And so, you know, that's linked in the description. People can read about that. A past guest I've had, Jim Jatras, former diplomat, he's referred to this as rainbow fascism. And then you read stuff, you know, the Wall Street Journal the other day reports DEI, diversity, what is it, equity and inclusion, is crushing military recruitment. Veterans worried about the quality of leadership are counseling young family members not to join up. But just basically your further thoughts on this, the hypocrisy of this liberal international globalist ideology, as well as the woke Imperium.
Yeah, well, I think there's one term that I actually was not fully familiarized with when I wrote Woke Imperium, but I am now, and I've written about it subsequently. There's a term I want more people to become aware of, which is coined by the scholar Emily Finley, and the term is democratism. And democratism is this belief that she says originates in Rousseau. I think there's just as strong a case that it originated in Immanuel Kant. But it's this idea that the state has an ideological mission, and that the ideological mission is human freedom. But most people don't want to go on, crusades for human freedom far away. And the further away you get, the harder it is to motivate them. So you, ironically, need to curtail freedom at home to get everyone in line so you can spread it abroad. And then one day, eventually, there'll be enough freedom that you can scale back the curtailment. It's basically like the PMC managed version of like trying to create a global worldview. Very much the liberal equivalent of Trotskyism. She makes a really good case that this has come up multiple times in history in multiple permutations before eventually becoming, with Woodrow Wilson, one of the dominant worldviews of the United States foreign policy elite. And then it didn't actually fully become a dominant worldview, of course, until the collapse of the USSR and the removing of inhibitions on the United States. Bringing that to, and I think that's what we're really talking about here, is this idea that like this hypocrisy is very unfortunate, but it's a temporary measure. So we just have to do the incredibly humble and realistic thing of destroying every society we don't like, and then we can come back and have true freedom again. So so as you said, 2 years ago, I wrote Woke Imperium. It was a dream of mine to write. I wanted to write Woke Imperium for years. I actually first came up with the idea when I was still in grad school and Coney 2012 happened. So I was sitting on that forever. And there was no one until I joined IPD who wanted to do it. Like I brought it up. I can't blame them. Also, people didn't see that it was coming as early as I did. To me, who was definitely a person who was like radicalized against the establishment by Bush, and by the religious right and stuff like that. Like, to me, it was obvious that there was going to be a liberal version. And then once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. And Coney 2012 proved to me that this is happening. That was backed by like a lot of people. We had like army officers on the news talking about Joseph Coney. Not why like America, it was to America's national interests, of course, but just as a thing under the R2P umbrella. And like it was just like all the warning signs were there. And then you had like Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, which just endlessly promised regime change in Syria based off of human rights concerns, which of course, we all know who the rebels in Syria were. So that's an added hoop. But like this thing was just building and building. And I was like, please, like, and then when I was at State Department, and I'm not complaining about it, I like my coworkers, I had fun there, but like I wasn't there that long. But like it was obvious that like the new millennial professional managerial class was very much becoming one of the dominant elements too. And all these things are coming together, and I'm like, I see this coming. This is like the new equivalent of like Ann Coulter saying that we should invade countries and convert them to our religion. Like I saw it coming, and no one wanted to publish it. And then finally, after I prove my cred at IPD, publish a few things with them, prove I'm a team player, we work on the Middle Powers project, which is still, I think, our most important work, because it's all about how middle powers are actually more important now than great powers, which is like the true multipolarity, right? It isn't China versus the US or New Cold War. It's that lots of people have caught up respective to their regions, and the world just isn't one thing versus the other. It's just many, many different things. Like, we did all that. And then I was like, okay, I've proved myself. Can I now do this thing that I've wanted to do for like, at that point, I don't know, 7 years. and yes, to my surprise, they said yes. And so it was really fun to research, because I had been putting, for all that time, I've been putting stuff to the side. I've been like, bookmark this, save this, because I just see these scattered examples. And I don't think a lot of people were seeing that they were connected, but it was, how things were sold, foreign interventions. It was the fact that there were like George Floyd posters in Kabul during the American occupation. Like, what the hell? There was people, the current UN ambassador, then, I don't remember what she was, Linda Thomas Grenfell. I don't remember what she was at that earlier point, but she was citing the 1619 Project while she was talking about diplomacy, and specifically in a way that kind of read as, look at us, we reckon with our past, we feel guilt and shame, and the implication being like other countries don't do that. Like we're more evolved than them. Like we've weaponized guilt to a new level as part of our superpower status. And this obviously, like, identity politics could always be used in an interventionist capacity. Lots of NGOs adopted it. Yeah, I also sold myself, to people that were more skeptical on the team about working on a project like this, because we are a totally nonpartisan think tank, and rightfully so. And but I sold myself as like, not only is this like this thing I want to do, it's also like I'm the person to do it because like I'm not conservative. Like you can't like claim that I'm doing it like for like right wing hit reasons, because I'm not at all. And I was like, I'm even willing, as much as I hate identity politics, to like sell myself on info levels just to like prove the legit. If it comes to that, thankfully it never did. And so it was just. But it was just necessary. Like, it was necessary because that was clearly the direction that liberal internationalism was moving. But my point in Woke Imperium, and I hope I make this quite clear, is not that like wokeness itself caused this or anything like that. Like, my point is that this was always how hyper interventionist global imperial states behave. They always come up with moral justifications, and those moral justifications are always targeted towards their equivalent of the professional managerial class. Roll back, a few decades ago, it would have been very different. It wouldn't have been like this. It could have been a moral majority based thing. I mean, under Bush, we almost flirted with that. His Africa policy is proof that there was an attempt to have this kind of religious conservatism that went into like abstinence only education funding that failed miserably in sub-Saharan Africa in the 2000s. So like this template was already here. This was already going to happen. This happened in the Cold War, in a sense. Anyone who was anti-communist got built up to be like part of a free world, even if there was nothing free about their society whatsoever. This is just like the millennial version, right? This is the way to get the millennials on board. But the problem is we do have a lot of people in the media, and even some in government, that do genuinely believe this stuff, which is, I think, far more dangerous than the cynical operators. And so they're harder to reason with. They're harder to say like, oh, scale this back, or this actually might not benefit society to do this, because they're really into it. They're the true believers. And I think there is the sense that of our peer competitors, of which we really only have China, but like of the revisionist powers that pose some danger, supposedly, to the world order, China and Russia, none of them are woke, right? And America in the 2010s became woke. So like it conflates domestic politics too, right? Which is the other thing I don't like. And it says like, if you want these things, you have to want them in our foreign policy. You have to stand up for countries. If another country has more influence, and you see this really sold in like Georgia right now, right? When there's this kind of shadow struggle over that started over a law that is the same law that the United States has. The U.S. has a law, justifiably so, about foreign actors, NGOs having to declare themselves as foreign actors if more than 40% of their budget, 50% of their budget comes from abroad. Georgia wanted to have that law, rightly so. And all of a sudden, because it's a society more than almost any other infiltrated by foreign NGOs, this huge uproar, just, of everything. And it's sold in this way. Like, these issues are sold this way. Like, well, if we don't have influence, everything is going to be like hyper reactionary. Everything is going to be extremely persecutory. I actually totally like, even though, yes, obviously I disagree with this on a foreign policy perspective. I'm dead set against any of this. But I also disagree with it, like, outside of just like the foreign policy strategy element. I think that the fundamental assumptions that like an internationalist project is the only way that other societies like introduce progressive reformism is just wrong. It's historically wrong. Like, I think it's the opposite. When a society tries to push a culture forming agenda or anything, or a financial, whatever, any kind of agenda, it actually becomes associated with foreign scheming, plotting, and domination of your society. Whereas if you did it yourself, it's much more likely to be a successful reform program. I'm not talking about any specific issue or if I disagree or agree with any particular thing. I'm just saying progressive reformism does better when it's like national, and this, rather than international. And this is actually I'm going to have an upcoming chapter in an edited book that will be out. I don't know when, but like in the next few months, where I make this case explicitly using historic examples. I view it as the chapter will be kind of like a sequel to Woke Imperium, like the constructive version, right? That was the critical version. This is the constructive version. And I talk about the early Turkish Republic, the Meiji period in Japanese history, and also the difference between like national communist governments and the internationalist Soviet Union. And to me, like it seems pretty obvious, historically speaking, that the more sovereign you are and the less beholden you seem to foreign interests, the more likely that you can institute domestic reforms, which undermines like the woke logic. Wokeness integrates perfectly with liberal internationalism and neoconservatism because they're all have that logic of like there's a global project. There's a kind of human that is more evolved, that is part of this global project. We can convert other people to this project. And then anyone who refuses is standing, quote unquote, against history, right? So you hear the phrase the right side of history, the wrong side of history. And I'm like, well, hey, show me where this is in history. But, it's just like, I think this just undermines the society's ability to do anything. Like, I think you actually increase the amount of reactionary activity in the country when you intervene in it. And so you see whether militarily or non-militarily. And I think, and then you also have the backlash of the great powers too. Like Russia is much more interested in culture war as a weaponized international project now because it's responding to what the United States is doing. I'm not really a fan of that either. And I also think that obfuscates their national interests as well. But it's inevitable. This is going to happen. If the US is constantly pushing stuff, then someone's going to push back. And in the end, that isn't even going to benefit the activists that agree with many of these causes, except to tie them closer to the American state and have them actually put faith in it, which is a particularly weird thing to see for me because, I'm just old enough that I remember social justice activists being very hostile to the American state. And that turnaround has been very, very, very rapid. And that's one of the more remarkable things.
Yeah, and just on that last point, what really gets me is like what Jim Gentry said, rainbow fascism, the woke imperium, is if historically if the custom or culture of some empire or whatever state is good, others will pick it up in some form. But when you're just shoving it down the throats of nations around the world, I recall not long ago reading. Ecuador, the State Department sent like $20,000 or something to finance LGBT transgenderism in Ecuador, which is a socially conservative nation. Why aren't they shoving social conservatism down other people's throats? Or in Kazakhstan, where I used to teach at the Nazarbayev Intellectual School. There's about 20 of them around the country, and I remember reading a story, not in the school where I work, but another campus. The Kazakh high school student, I think it was a boy, beginning to wear a female dress, which in the socially conservative that does not fly in Kazakhstan. 95%, 98% of Kazakhs like, no, we don't do that. Sadly, the kid ended up jumping out of a 9th floor apartment building and killing himself. My apartment in Kazakhstan was on the 9th floor, but that's just an example. It's like, just real quick on that before I want to get to NATO. It's crazy. I mean, they're really shoving it down people's throats. It's too forced. No.
Yeah, well, it's obviously forced, like to the point where it's like eye rolling. I actually think that they've done it so badly that it doesn't work anymore. Like I already feel like, as much as I want to toot my own horn, I already feel that woke imperium is almost obsolete, right? Because like I feel like everyone has seen this, and we already see like I think some of these issues are being de-emphasized in this election season of American politics. But the one place that we do still see it, and where I would say like, oh boy, like keep an eye on this. Is that in countries that want American approval and want American intervention on their behalf, this is a tactic that they use now. So both Ukraine and Israel have been very big on stuff like this. Ukraine, who I would say is domestic politics, is not very different from Russia's at all in in actual practice. Is really selling this whole like we're going to be, you know, just like the Czech Republic if you help us, and we're really looking out for, you know, whatever. And I think Israel's really leaned into it since October 7th. You see a ton of well, you know, like Hamas would like kill gay people, so gay people should support Israel. Like very, very weird, like tortured plot. I don't even see how that, but but you know, yeah, it's like lots of this, like, oh look, there's a pride parade in Tel Aviv every year, or you know, very clearly it is now. I think it was predominantly the U.S. seeing this as a way to get countries to like further integrate into its defense network. Now I actually think that's going to be less emphasized. Like more and more people have seen, like the Jake Sullivans of the world have seen truly that, you know, the unipolar moment is over. They're going to have to be like a little bit more accommodating. But I do feel like the smaller countries are now like, it's almost like a reverse Paul's woke imperium, right? Like the smaller countries are now going to be like, we are woker than the countries we feel threatened by. Therefore, you should extend your defense alliances to us. Therefore, you should give us weapons. Therefore, you should support our irredentist claims. There, you know, that's what we're going to see, right? Is the smaller countries become kind of the shall we say, the yikes sweaty problematic people, right? Like they're gonna like, we're oppressed, come save us. You know, it's your job to save us. Don't you care about social justice? So like that I think is more where it's headed right now. But yeah, it serves the role. It serves as one of the multiple forms of glue to pretend that the U.S. alliance network is a values-based alliance network, which I think if it was rational, it wouldn't be. And I'm deeply afraid of it being one. But, you know, you have enough of these people that I think do genuinely believe this. And some of them are in the federal government. All of them are in the media. And it's just very disturbing to me because we're going to get talked into something we don't like if we're not careful, based off of these kind of like domestic politics triggers, which is incredibly unhealthy, not good.
Yeah, I would say it's. I mean, it's the government, it's the media. You said it's academia, it's the upper class in the U.S. This liberal, you know, it's gotten down to a large portion of America, and even beyond. You know, where I used to teach in Mexico, at the Mexican elite establishment, they were very woke Imperium too. It's just unbelievable. But and just what you said earlier, you know, we need dictatorship to terraform the world, and then we'll go back to democracy. That's never happened, you know, in history. And there was an article the other day saying some liberal internationalists again saying we need a militant democracy to save democracy from Trump, and it's like. What? Like we have to become it's so Orwellian, as you referenced earlier. Like we have to become a dictatorship to prevent democracy. And you know, I'm obsessed with world government, which I view as what we're talking about. You know, internationalism, globalism. I think the ultimate goal is to have one world empire. And there's been a Swedish academic. I haven't had time to read his book yet, but it's titled "From Despotism to Democracy: How a World Government Can Save Humanity." And the essence of his argument is like, look, we got a lot of problems on the planet. We need to establish a totalitarian one world government to solve these problems, and then we can go back to being a democracy. And I'm just like what planet? What planet are these liberal, you know, woke academics on? Like it's
that
like,
is the most Swedish thing I've ever heard. I mean, if there's one country that truly embodies the woke imperium, okay, well these days it's Germany, but traditionally it's Sweden. But it's very much this kind of like Germanic North Sea type. Like it's very much the continuity of like, I think like both Kantianism and the Reformation. This very like strident, like we have to go, we have to save, we have to take a stand. And like I think it's bizarre the stuff you get from and yeah, you're right. It's all around the world. It's a certain class though. And the further away you move from the North Atlantic, the more specific it is just to that class. And it's often like a very despised kind of like upper middle class, like the you know, Iranian equivalent of NPR libs, right? At home it manifests like in this resistance lib mentality that like you're mentioning, right? It's like Trump is so dangerous that like we have to take extraordinary measures to stop him. And it's like, okay, well, first of all, like you guys lose elections every other season, so like you're just going to give Trump that whatever law you passed anyway. And like second of all, like I'm no Trump fan at all, but like I don't get where this comes from because like he's not like more threatening to me than most other politicians, and you know it's very weird that but that's the point, right? You build up an emergency and then they unfortunately conflate foreign policy with it, right? There's some people in the realism and restraint community that seem to think that like a second Trump administration would be like good for us, and my position is to disagree, not because of any of the resistance lib stuff, but actually from the opposite side, because I think the Trump administration empowers those people, and then they say anything good he might do diplomatically then becomes like bad, right? And then the media says it's bad. So, like, he did a really good thing when he talked to Kim Jong Un. You know, like his North Korea policy was really cool. I wish his Middle East policy had been like that, but you know, whatever. He did a really cool thing with that, and they freaked out. They absolutely freaked out, and then everyone had to hear on the media how he loves dictators and how he's gonna sell us out to them or whatever. And it's like that's ridiculous. If we go through that again, watch out. You know that this might happen again. That the liberal internationalism might get a real temporary second boost from another Trump administration. Whereas I kind of think a Harris administration, which will lean entirely into liberal internationalism, who knows what disasters will befall from that. But they're going to bring everyone, the Cheneys, you know, all the centrists, the media, down with them. When they inevitably fail, and they would fail because they don't have a good view of the world, but they're going to bring everyone down with them, I think, and totally discredit liberal internationalism. But you know, that's my hypothesis there. I'm not voting for either of these people, so don't take any of this as an endorsement. But it's just, you know, I think the resistance lib stuff meets the criteria for like domestic fascism as much as anything else because it is pro censorship, pro war, pro chauvinism, and it's all done under the guise of like progressive liberalism and spreading values, and you know that's just how it is, right? It's just pro security state.
Yeah, I'm not voting. I'm not voting, and I wouldn't vote for either. And I've also got a thesis that the defense establishment could utilize a Trump. You know, Trump loves Mike Pompeo. I've heard other, you know, Tom Cotton, Mark Fabio. If I'm not mistaken, that those were potential appointments for his administration. But it would be the pendulum swing from the other end, where there are some interests that want to go to war with the axis of resistance, right? Russia, Iran, China, Venezuela, and then who better than to have this sort of, on paper, seemingly, you know, conservative, patriotic figure like Trump to rally around patriots to go to war with China or Iran, because, you know, I just mentioned earlier that because of DEI, recruitment is declining. But if you get someone like Trump in with wrapped in the flag, you might see an uptick, and people say, "Yeah, let's war with China, Iran, Russia." And real quick, I wanted to ask you about NATO again. A wonderful piece just published a few weeks ago. Link is in the description. Titled "NATO: The Gargoyle of Globalism." I was going to read at length from it, but I'll skip that. People should read the article. But essentially, you know, it says the summary of your piece: post-Cold War NATO is an avatar for globalism's war on the national interest, guarding the Church of the liberal international order as a sacred space. And I've been commenting on this recently. You know, we're seeing the incoming Prime Minister of Japan. He's got a, you know, insane hard-on for NATO. He's like, and South Korea is like, we want American nukes. Japan is like, we want American nukes or nuke sharing. We want to become members of NATO. We've got this talk of Asian NATO. Retired Admiral Stavridis wrote a piece some months back saying, let's just cut the foreplay, take Thailand and Singapore and Philippines and make them NATO members. I've read globalist think tanks not long ago say Mexico should become a member of NATO. And then I read a piece saying we should rename North Atlantic Treaty Organization to New Alliance Treaty Organization to basically make it a one world, you know, global army. And so that, you know, overlaps with what you're saying. It's like, this seems like this is their goal now, to become the world army. Just your thoughts on the NATO, the gargoyle of globalism.
Yeah, I'm really proud of the name, by the way. Not every time do you get your chosen name through the editorial process, but we lucked out there. Um, yeah, no, my view on NATO is very much complementary with my like hostility towards permanent and values-based alliances. And the international world is always changing, always shifting. The idea that an alliance would be permanent is silly. Like there aren't that many of them in history, like at all. And even then, permanent means like I don't know, more than 50 years. Like there just aren't very many at all. The longest one I can think of off the top of my head is the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, which is like, I don't know, 400 years old. Yeah, but that's extreme outlier. Like most of the time, alliances, they're for a few decades. They barely ever make it to a century, much less beyond. And the idea that they can just be locked in perpetually is odd, especially when all the alliance members, with the possible exception of South Korea, have like so deindustrialized that like who is even the arsenal for their collective defense, right? So you have this NATO specifically um, was ostensibly, and yes, I know that word's doing a lot of work here, a defensive alliance for the North Atlanticist for the U.S., Canada, and Western Europe in the Cold War. Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General, obviously an Anglo by the name, he said, quite honestly, its role was to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. That's a defined goal for a specific alliance. It is with the end of Soviet Union, however, and it being its main reason to exist. Of course, they thought the Soviet Union was an offensively oriented power. In actual effect, it was not. Both sides of the Cold War thought the other side would attack them at any moment. Neither side was particularly interested in attacking the other. But that was, you don't know your enemy's intentions until historians can pick through the archives. So they thought this was a deterrence in the Soviet Union. Maybe it was, but probably the Soviet Union would not have conventionally attacked it. But whatever. It had its purpose, but then it goes away. Soviet Union goes away. So you would expect either NATO would go away or it would just be like a formality. It would be like, okay, you could even say, oh, like, triumphalism of the 90s. Maybe it does expand to some degree. Maybe it goes to Czech Republic, whatever, Poland. But like the fact that it would have maximalists go up to Russia's border, the fact that it would take the three Baltic states, the fact that it would even flirt with Ukraine without acknowledging that it would be a pushback. Like imagine Mexico or Canada talking about a defensive alliance with Russia. The U.S. would probably not react great to that. So it automatically lost its defensive status the second it started just growing and growing in the mid 90s through the 2000s. This was obviously going to create conflict. Whereas before it didn't necessarily create conflict. It was supposed to supposedly deter it. And then, of course, you have its use in the war on terror, right? So NATO's Article 5, attack on one is attack on all, only has ever been invoked in response to 9/11, which had nothing to do with Russia, the Soviet Union, an attack on Europe. You had German and other troops stationed in Afghanistan for what was first, a counterterrorism, but then became nation building. Far more dubiously. And then you have NATO countries all conspiring together to conduct regime change in Libya. So obviously, this is now an offensive alliance, not a defensive alliance. So, okay, there's that pause. Then keep going forward. And it becomes obvious that this is like the largest scale, very successful alliance that the United States has with that many partners in it. And it's got useful bureaucratic connections. It's got lots of arms deals, whatever. It's probably quite profitable for many people higher up in it. So what now seems to be the thing is, our unipolarity is gone and or slipping. I mean, it is gone. It's been gone since the recession, but in DC, minds change much slower. So it's going in slow mo to them. And maybe we should take this model and just export it. So first you have people talking about like, let's have an Asian thing. And then you get other people that are like, let's just make NATO worldwide. And what this really does, and this ties into the woke Imperium, this ties in with other things, is this attempt to artificially construct like a block of like the free societies, the quote unquote civilized world, against like, the other barbarian, and who is all conflated with each other, right? On either a values based or what have you. And so it's kind of like trying to get all the status quo powers to join one giant global NATO. The problem, of course, aside from the fact that this is probably unsustainable, is that all these different regions have regional powers whose interests are always first in their own region. So the more you grow it, the more divides you're going to have. I mean, already there's such huge divides between Eastern and Western Europe in NATO. Already there's Turkey and Hungary who want to maintain their strategic autonomy and still follow the national interest while being part of NATO. And they get, shrieked at constantly by the countries who are just compliant to go along with the group. And this is already producing problems for the alliance. So, like, imagine the problems you'd have if it's like time to bring the Japanese self-defense force to Donbass, or the Ukrainian conscript to Taiwan Strait. Like like this would come apart immediately. It's farce. But like the danger it shows is that there are a lot of these people, this kind of like global cosmopolitan class, if you will, like of academics, media people, whatever, that genuinely think this is a good idea and are going to try to like force this. And of course, how do you get all these disparate people in a polycentric world to have common interests? You sell it as being like only America can like defend the values of freedom, and so it becomes like a global project, but it doesn't represent anyone's interest. This is like saying that like Marvel movies are good cinema because they appeal to lots of people. Like, but even then, it doesn't have the ability that lots of people would buy into it, right? It's just like it's this idea that everyone deep down inside every foreigner is like someone who wants to listen to NPR. And this is like the way to do it, right? Like we're going to bring all those people together. And I just find it utterly ridiculous. And I think even if you had an Asian NATO, well, it would have to be completely separate from the European NATO. And the only commonality would be like the US provides, like, I guess, logistical support, whatever. But like, even then, like an Asian NATO will inevitably force some countries who have, because these regions have autonomy too, the countries that don't get along with the countries that join to come even closer to China, right? So like, wouldn't it be better for like Indonesia to be a neutral country rather than, part of an Asian NATO, or maybe alienated and become allied to China? Why not just have a neutral country there? Why not have more autonomy where countries have to look out for their own interests? Like, Japan is the third largest economy in the world, and it still, unlike most developed countries, has an impressive industrial base. It's also very reliant on trade for natural resources. Like, it's in Japan's self-interest to have a more autonomous policy. It's also not in China's interest to constantly antagonize Japan. Like, they do it for domestic political reasons, but their foreign policy towards Japan is pretty moderate. They know it's stupid to make a permanent enemy there. And Japan's strong enough that it can stand more on its own. So like what you have here with these, like, NATO creates dependency. It created a lot of dependent countries in Europe. If you made an Asian NATO or an African NATO, even more ridiculous, it would create more dependent relationships where the US is perpetually footing the defense bill and gaining influence in a way that might violate the smaller country's sovereignty, while also in return getting hordes of lobbyists who influence our domestic politics in unnatural ways. How many APACs do you want, right? Like, how many of these things? It's not good. It's never good. And so you just get a relationship that benefits certain people in both countries, but who doesn't benefit either of the countries' long-term interests. And it creates, okay, so this new Cold War thing it should be obvious. I think it's BS. But if there's one country that's trying to do it, it's actually the United States. It's not Russia or China, because the United States wants everything to be these permanent, locked-in, dependent alliances obsessed with, the common front values, whatever, and who are unable to show flexibility in their relations, who are unable to even conceptualize things like non-alignment and neutrality. But the funny thing is, in my opinion, the US has like the best of the status quo powers position. And it's actually weakened by overextension due to defense spending, due to war weariness, due to the fact that we don't even know what we're paying money for. It would actually benefit us if more countries were non-aligned rather than allied. It counts as like buffer states. It counts as like a separation. Not everything is an escalation. Not everything is a potential intervention. Not everything can become like Ukraine. The point is regional powers are always going to have disproportionate influence. We need to understand that there are regions where we are not the dominant actor. And in order to do that, I think we need to see, oh yeah, more autonomous, more less aligned countries. They've closed the gap. There's no chance that China can dominate the world like the US did in 1990. There's no chance the US can. Nobody can. That world is so over. This world is as much middle powers as it is great powers now. And it's actually the US would benefit from the middle powers being strong because all its rivals are supposedly revisionist great powers. Well, guess what's the first line of defense against those? A strong middle power that can keep its region from outside influence. A strong Turkey diminishes Russia's ability to completely dominate the Caucasus. It's stronger, more independent countries in Europe, maybe working together in alliance, maybe at least just a few great powers, whatever. That keeps Russia influence in Europe at a minute. Japan having a more autonomy, Indonesia having more autonomy, that prevents them from being footballs in a game between China and the US. So this whole idea that NATO should expand is, I think, kind of a last gasp attempt to really have a globalist foreign policy by taking one of their few supposed successes and trying to export it. But it was designed for a very specific context in a very specific place. It will not be easily grafted onto other people. And people all around the world, even if they are liberal internationalists, must understand all politics now is regional first. And that means that these various countries have to have enough autonomy to have their own regional arrangements. And it also means that the United States has to rediscover that it too has a region. It too has geographic limits. It needs to set a line of where it's not worth bothering with anymore and what it wants to focus on. And this idea that we can go into every region and prevent there from being regional hegemony there is just, it's disastrous, frankly, because it's eventually going to lead us into something where we don't have what IR people call escalation dominance, i.e. where we're not motivated to be there and someone else is, and they will eventually win. I think Ukraine is a great example of this right now, by the way. The Vietnam War in the past would be another one. And it's just no, you've got to know your limits. And so do other people. It's the global project has failed. I mean, maybe if you're not a Fortune 500 company, but from a geopolitical perspective, it has completely failed. And anyone that's trying to resurrect it, especially if they're taking NATO and trying to awkwardly apply that framework elsewhere and treating it effectively as the hard power spear tip of the globalization project, which is what that recent paper I wrote is about, it's going to fail. It's going to fail. It's going to be a huge waste of everyone's time. And it's going to actually create a lot of antagonism and distort the natural flows, I think, of regional development. So it's just honestly, it's just destabilizing. And it's dangerous that people would want to do this. But I also don't think it will succeed. So we'll see what happens.
Lately, I've been joking that World War III will begin when the North and South Koreans begin shooting at each other in Ukraine, which would be, it'd be great. Was that Charlie Sheen Hot Shots part? That could be Hot Shots Part 3 right there. But just real quick, another question or two. Just your thought
sure.
on this vector of this third world war, because you mentioned it's declining the woke Imperium, the globalist American empire, and the NATO gargoyles. But that's that moment, Graham Allison and others have talked about the Thucydides trap. So that's a danger moment where they could go crazy or, go out with a bang, or a whimper, just your thought on, well, we're hearing all this rhetoric. It's the media, they're hyping stuff up, but you do see world leaders, Erdogan recently talking about World War III, Indonesia's head talking about World War III, the Russians, the Americans, and so just you think it's a possibility?
It's always a possibility. I don't think it's the most likely possibility, but it is a possibility. Certainly, like a greater degree of escalation. This is also to tie into the previous point. Like this is actually why it's good to have regionalism, because if everything is hyper globalized, then any regional war can become a global war. And a problem that we have is that, and when people like globalize based on values, they say this is the great crusade for democracy. We have to go, right? And it's related to our relationship with history, because there's one thing I really, really, really hate about how history is used in international relations is that everyone goes to World War II analogies. Everything is Neville Chamberlain. Everything is appeasement, which is always used to attack diplomacy. Everyone ignores all the compromises of the Cold War. Everyone ignores that people who were World War II veterans were often not hawks when they took office. In fact, they did everything in their power to avoid that ever happening again. Everyone avoids the fact that even if the only wars you can reference are world wars, the world we live in today, the situation is far closer to 1914 than it is 1939. You should worry about the July crisis, right? A cascading sequence of seemingly unrelated events that drag overly tied together alliance networks into a massive destructive conflict that ultimately benefits none of them. That's much more of a proper thing to look at than the endless amounts of World War II analogies. And World War II, of course, would not have happened without World War One. So it's really just like phase two of the diplomatically even more important phase one. So like people really need to get over like the World War II stuff. I think that would actually help us avoid World War III more if we did that. My personal favorite opinion piece I've ever written is actually "Not Everything is World War II" is the title. It's an American conservative piece. I absolutely love it. That is I basically make this case more heavily that World War II is just a bad analogy because nothing in the world today is like it, and to take such an outlier just because we have been romanced by it and its mythology so much is actually a very, very bad idea when there's so many other things that happened in history. And even World War II itself, the narrative can be oversimplistic because it ignores like the complicated relationship of countries like Thailand and Finland to the Axis powers and whatnot. So there's like, that's this whole thing. But like, as for a conflict's ability to spiral into a global one, I mean, this is why I support regionalism. I think that obviously people are right to be concerned about Taiwan, to be concerned about Israel and Iran, to be concerned about Ukraine. Right now, I'm the most concerned with Israel and Iran because there's just the biggest pro-war lobby that really has no constraints on it is the Iran war lobby in Washington. And also, of course, the Israel lobby on a more domestic front, right? Just really, I mean, they are the most, I can't hate them as an organization because they are so good at what they do. and as a realist, I just respect it, but I really, really hate the American politicians that go along with it. Absolutely. It's absolutely ridiculous. Those are all worth, being worried about. And you should always be a little bit of a scaredy cat because it helps make the case that like these people need to control themselves and that we shouldn't be globalizing all of these things. But my perhaps spicy take on future big conflict zones is that while there is a risk of all of these, of course, I don't think the Taiwan risk is as high in the next 5 to 10 years as a lot of people do. I just don't think that China has the like amphibious landing craft, but in the long term, that one will grow. Only with time will that grow. The Middle East thing could blow up at any moment. The Ukraine one almost seems to have kind of settled out, and even maybe be in the process of like all the Ukraine backers kind of throwing it overboard and being like, "Oh, we have enough commitments." So it's hard to see. I'm actually worried the least about that unless something comes and changes. Although it was very concerning early on. But for me, and this goes back like decades and decades, my number one concern with a world war is actually Pakistan. And I think that Pakistani state failure, which is always a possibility, and the fact that it would be state failure in a country where they have nuclear weapons, and a very complicated relationship with some of their neighbors. I think the odds of a Pakistani state failure leading to massively increased, not just India trying to gain gains from such a situation, but also like China, who is Pakistan's like true ally. China coming in and having to play a role in trying to stabilize or play around in that country, which would then bring in U.S. involvement, as a counterpoint to that. To me, this is like the ultimate like potential cascade failure. I'm not saying that I think this will happen in the near future, and the other three ongoing conflicts are obviously much more important right now. But in the long-term scale of things, like when I think about like the nightmare scenario, I think a Pakistani state failure first, because I just see so many variables with great powers, nuclear armed great powers, and non-great powers with nuclear weapons. And there's just a lot going on there that I could just see. There's so many different ways that that could really turn into a global conflict in a way that some of these other things might not. So that's what I keep an eye on for. But yeah, I don't think World War III is right now our most immediate thing, but it's a realistic possibility. It is not just a hypothetical. And the fact that we have people that must globalize all conflict greatly adds to the risk rather than subtracts from it. So,
All right, my last question. I won't ask you to make a prediction. Let's call it an extrapolation, or forecast. Your thought on the future, the road ahead. Where are we trending toward? You already mentioned it's the decline of the Western woke Imperium. All the hype, all the rage today is BRICS, multipolarity. So just your final thought, and where's the world order headed?
okay. Well, BRICS is not a defense alliance, which is kind of why it works. I think if it became a defense alliance, it wouldn't work, because it would have the same problem as NATO and attempts to make new NATOs, which is it's too big. It's too big, and there's too many different contrary uh, national interests there, and so that would be a problem. The And of course, my main point is with two big alliances is if they ignore the national interest, even if you're successful, then you actually get bad foreign policy because you forget what's in your own interest, as the U.S. sometimes does. But I think, nevertheless, BRICS as an association is actually really interesting and impressive, because it's basically stating that the developing world is actually developing. It is not the third world. It's a developing world, and that increases their power. And the single most important thing to explain both unipolarity and its decline is that at the end of World War II, the U.S. made 50% of all manufactured goods in the world. It was over 50% of the world's economy. So that's logistics, man. It all comes back to that in the end. And the U.S. now is slightly less than a quarter of the world's economy, still super impressive, obviously, but also significantly less than that in manufacturing capacity, which is the even more important metric. Sorry, economists. And the BRICS are growing. It's not just China, it's all these countries, all these like middle powers, all these regional powers. And that's just going to make it so much harder for anyone to set a global agenda. So it's just going to be harder to have an empire, because more and more people are just going to have their own spheres of influence and their own ability to push back. And the BRICS is a logical adaptation to like the neoliberal quest to subsume everyone to like North Atlantic capital. They're like, actually, we're going to do our own thing. We're going to have our own policies. And maybe one day we won't use the dollar anymore. We're going to do all these things to increase our own sovereignty, because in the end, that's what development's ultimate goal is from a security perspective. It's to increase your own sovereignty, and to decrease the amount of foreign influence that can be had over you and your autonomy of action. So like BRICS is cool. It's interesting to see an association. It kind of reminds me of the Cold War's non-aligned league, which in my opinion was the most interesting thing to happen in the Cold War. But more successful in a way, because it's really just focused on development and kind of collaboration on economic policy. Very cool stuff. But I think if it were to ever become a military alliance, it would fail. And so it would come apart, or they just have to throw out that aspect of it. So, if they're, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of countries not wanting to be influenced by the great powers at all and having a kind of mutual defense pact against like China, Russia, United States, like everyone. But like, I just don't think that, yeah, like the context now is different enough. I don't think it is even necessary. I think that it's, the alliances are going to be localized. The action is going to be localized. Some of these BRICS countries, they're nowhere near each other. So it's just not going to happen. South Africa isn't going to be defending Turkey or vice versa. But, you know, Turkey will absolutely be, and it is active in the Black Sea. It is active in the diplomacy of the Ukraine war. They are using their strength and position. And I actually have a report on the IPD website all about just Turkey as a middle power, because it's, I would say, geopolitically the most advanced middle power right now in kind of reclaiming the autonomy of the smaller countries on the world stage. And but Turkey's not going to be an outlier. That's the thing. What Turkey's doing now is what India is going to do next, and what, you know, what Iran's more like kicked out, but you know, it's doing the same thing. Maybe one day Indonesia will do this. Maybe one day Japan will be more autonomous. Maybe one day even Brazil. There is this possibility that, you know, autonomy is growing for smaller countries. Their gap, their industrial economic gap is closing, and they will therefore be more powerful. And that's a warning to all the countries that think that they can dictate the world, because this is a world where no one can dictate anything from a from a universal standard. That this is the return of polycentrism, which I would remind everyone is the natural state of the human geopolitical system for 99.9% of human history. It was American unipolarity that is the extreme freakish outlier. And so when we get all the people going, this is not normal, when, you know, a country says no and gets away with it, or, you know, does whatever. Well, actually, this is the most normal thing in the world. The abnormal thing is thinking that tastemakers in DC and Brussels actually have a say over these things. The age of the European expansion is over. We're back now to, you know, how things were before.
I hope so. We'll see. So we've sort of covered the absolute waterfront here. Your articles are in the description. I highly recommend people go and read them. Where are the best places to find new projects, websites, and all that?
Most of my stuff gets put on the IPD website. Even if I publish externally, sometimes it will be. I publish pretty frequently with national interest and responsible statecraft. It's also all over the place. I got a piece here, got a piece there. My personal blog has a publications tab that should list everything there. But in general, yeah, go to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, see the work we're all doing, because it is very much tied not just with realism or restraint, but specifically with the nature of multipolarity and how the middle powers are actually the critical ingredient. So that's like the theme of, I'd say, the majority of us that work there at this point. So yeah, check out our middle powers report. That perhaps might be the most relevant thing, but I think people would enjoy that.
Yeah, all the links are in the description. Follow Chris on X, peacediplomacy.org, geotrickster.com. Everything is there. Thanks, Chris, and keep up the great work.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.